Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Cristi Macelaru, and we are the Cabrillo Festival of Contemporary Music. We are joined today in our series of composers in conversation by three of the composers that we have presented in the past in Cabrillo. Of course, Missy Mazzoli, Karim Al-Zand, and Carlos Simon. Hello, everyone. How are you guys doing?
Hello, great to be here.
Hi, nice to see you.
Amazing. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. So you all three were in Cabrillo, so you've experienced our warm, beautiful, alive, engaging audience that always wants to know a little bit more about what goes on beyond the sounds and the beautiful music that we hear, which is why we created this series so that we can allow we allow anyone that wants to get to know a little bit more about the process of creating music. And for me, music is all about the spiritual connection that it creates with people. It creates both across time and across space, and it's a incredible representation of the capacity that we have to connect with each other, and I think of music in this way, and you as composers, as performers as well, but mainly as composers, you are the one that like generates that spark, right? Like in beginning that conversation. How, Missy, how do you think about that? I mean, I guess it's not a responsibility, but that privilege, to be the person that sparks that first conversation.
Yes, I mean, great start to a very interesting conversation. Usually I get like, what's your process or what's your inspiration? And such a great question. Yeah, I mean, I write music to connect with other people. I write music to feel less alone, and I write music to understand the world and to have like a more extensive common language with which to describe the world, understand the world, and connect with other people in the world. And you know, like growing up, I would learn about composers who said that they didn't care about the audience, or I would encounter people who said they didn't care about the audience, and I just like fundamentally didn't understand that. And I can sort of respect it now as an adult, that people are writing for themselves, but I'm like, but the piece isn't done until you've performed it. It's like the closing of the process, like closing of the loop, is to share it with other people and receive that feedback from them, even if it's nonverbal, just the energy of performing in a room. So I gladly take on that responsibility, and not in a heavy-handed way, but like I just think that that's such a natural part of writing, is this process of sharing and connecting with people.
Mm-hmm. And in our last conversation that we had, actually, the idea of courage came up as part of what it takes to allow yourself to be vulnerable, because it is a conversation, but the intimacy that music brings us to, when we share it, it's actually quite special, because you don't, it's not a surface kind of experience, it's really quite deep. Carlos, how do you find that courage, or do you think it requires courage to share those deep thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, music being sort of a spiritual connection, if you will. And I'm a son of a preacher, so like I know I just know how these things work, and I feel like music has that ability to connect and on a much deeper level than emotions. It's I really believe that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and music has that way of connecting those dots. And um, it means more to me to have a person come up to me after a concert and say, I really, connected with this piece, on the level that I, as a composer, I didn't expect, other people to connect on, and then these things are important to consider as I'm writing, and to really consider, what am I trying to say? And as a composer, it's more than just the music. Also, what are you trying to say? If it's political or if it's something that's not political, or I believe these are all things that you have to consider, and in hopes of connecting with our audience and hoping to create discussions and other avenues.
Karim, I always, and I think I have told you this before, but I've always really enjoyed the fact that I feel like with every piece of music that you write, there's always another point of view that comes from somewhere else, to begin that inspiration. I feel like you present so many diverse kind of ideas that either it's a painting or a poem or a thought, a story or something like this. So is that, do you look for that story, or is that something that speaks to you and you sort of like file them in the back of your mind and you're like, okay, I have to write about this one day?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I have a notebook where I keep these, well, it's a digital notebook, it's not a physical notebook, where I sort of keep track of all of these things that I encounter in life. If I find a poem that really resonates with me, or a painting that I love, or a film that really moves me, or even an article or something, I'll make a note of it. I'm very prone to sort of falling into internet rabbit holes. I don't know if any of you composers do this, but where you find something and then that leads you to something else and then something else, and before you know it, you're listening to something you've never heard before, which I love that experience. So I try to, oftentimes that won't happen necessarily when I'm being commissioned for a piece, so I try to keep track of it so that I can go back to it. Should I get a commission, I have these sort of ideas or inspirations, or just could be photographs, whatever they are, that I know have resonated with me in some way. And so then I'll go back to this big file that I have and just kind of comb through it to see if anything might be fodder for something that I'm going to write. So I found that method very, as chaotic as it is, I find it very useful, because it's a little difficult to, if someone commissions you to write songs, just to sort of go out and look for poems, right away. I mean, you can do that, right, but it's often good to have a kind of cache already that you kind of know that will work for you.
And just a quick follow-up. Do you ever go back and you think, okay, like this has completely lost its relevance to me, and I'm just throwing it out of the notebook?
Yeah, well, I see the notebook has been going for so long that the end, it's all done sort of chronologically. So I often skip to the end of the document because some of the early things are from a long time ago. So yeah, that certainly happens.
Yeah, cool. Now, you all three work in academia as well. So you all three teach. And I'm curious about one thing, because speaking of that spirituality, I also find that the connection between a mentor and a student, or a teacher student, it's also somewhat spiritual on some level, and especially with composition, how do you substitute being able to see someone face to face, because I'm sure you've had to teach lessons online this past year, right? So did you find it difficult, or was it okay? Missy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that compared to, people who are trying to take violin lessons on Zoom, I mean, we kind of lucked out. I think you can get a lot done with composition lessons online. And I mean, I started this whole program, Luna Composition Lab, for mentoring young people. And that was even long pre-pandemic, was totally online. And I remember when we started to do it, we were like, can composition lessons be taught on the internet? And it was totally great. It was totally fine. So yeah, it's a little slower for me and my students. Like, it takes me a second, and there isn't that sort of direct connection, and I don't have like my library of scores that I can just like pull off the wall and share with them. And but I think that it's okay, And I'm really looking forward to being back in person, though, I have to say, for so many reasons. But I do think it is a spiritual thing. I mean, I just can't help but think of my former teacher, Louis Andreessen, who just passed away 2 days ago at 82. And, you know, for decades and decades had this legacy of teaching people from around the world long after he had to teach. I mean, he didn't have to teach for money or for prestige or fame or anything. He wanted to. And I definitely feel like in reflecting on him in these last 2 days, he had such a profound impact on my life, even outside of music. He lived a life that I would love to live, and where he was surrounded by people and art and ideas all the time. And so I think that the teacher-student relationship, wherever it's happening, can be that profound, because I've experienced that.
You know, and maybe I'm wrong, so I don't know, but I happen to think that music actually requires a certain amount of stealing, you know, done by the student, you know, where the student has to actively be so obsessed with the idea of gaining this knowledge and gaining this experience that you can show the road, sort of, you know, guide them. But they have to be the ones doing the stealing, right? The acquiring of culture, I guess I should say. Carlos, how do you encourage, or how do you find that balance, you know, of what's encouraging someone to say, look, you really got to go steal this, you know, like I can't just teach you how to compose, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it really is about, you know, helping the student find their voice in that way, and it depends on their background, the culture, what they believe in, these types of things, and so like it's really about understanding where they come from and how to point them in the right direction. Say, hey, you know, there's a composer. I remember very vividly one of my teachers. Before I started studying with him, I was sort of writing these, you know, crafty pieces, you know, where I just learning counterpoint or trying to figure out some technique or whatever, but nothing that was indicative of who I am as a composer, as a person. And he's like, you have these, you know, you grew up in a gospel church, Pentecostal church, you have these amazing, these chops, these techniques, but you're not using it in your piece. And he was Greek, you know, and he always incorporated Greek idioms, musical idioms into his music. And that was sort of life-changing to me, because I always thought they were two different worlds. You know, I wouldn't think to put gospel music and, you know, Western classical music and marry them to the two. So anyway, I try to duplicate that with my students, you know, and trying to meet them where they are and point them in the right direction. And of course he did. He's like, look at these composers, you know, look at William Bochum, look at Michael Dougherty, and these composers who are using the popular idioms, but infusing them into the space.
And this reminds me, as you're saying this, that I actually, you know, am very privileged to have actually had the chance to study a little bit composition with Karim. So Karim was one of my composition, and I apologize again, Karim, you know, for my inability to finish anything, you know, and in my composition. I think that toccata for piano that I was working on, I think it's still sitting on my desk, you know, but you always. You know, with everything that we talked about, you would always say, you know, did you ever check out this composer? And, you know, have you listened to this? Like, see how they answered that question, you know? And you were always so methodically organized about trying to help me continue to search and to find what I was looking for, you know, rather than, you know, give an answer immediately, you know. And this leads me to a question that we have. And the question says, it is so interesting to see your spaces. How does your workspace and the objects you place there impact your work? Karim.
Well, my office is decorated, as you can see, at least part of it is, with a lot of postcards. So I tend to be very inspired by visual art. So, you know, every time I go to any place, I try to go to the art museums that are in that area, and I kind of collect the art that moves me, that I think is you know, most profound to me. So these are collections from all over the place. So I kind of keep them around just to beautify the space, but also to, you know, several of them actually I've written pieces based on as well. So yeah, I do try to keep a lot of books around as well, poetry, plays, that kind of thing, just to kind of have them close at hand. But otherwise, I guess my space is a little organized, a little disorganized. I don't know.
It's very organized.
Is it?
I
Okay.
know. I mean, I think compared with other spaces that I've seen, yours is like it's unbelievably organized. Sorry to interrupt.
No, no. I mean, well, it's and then that's good. I guess it's the opposite of my mind, which is not that organized. It's if I can organize my office, then I'm halfway there.
Right, right, right. Carlos, do you? I mean, to the same answer, to the same question, but I also have a side question as well. Do you start with pen and paper, or do you go directly to the computer?
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly, you know, piano's here, so I improvise, you know, and I record my improvisations and then sort of craft everything at the computer. And then when I have a drafting table over on this side, the room is really unorganized, by the way. You only see the organized space, but so again, then I take the draft, the score, and just sort of edits and, you know, all the grunt work that comes with composing. But the most important part of my space that you know, it's important is you can't see it, but it's pictures of all of my relatives that have gone on. You know, I've mentioned, you know, I'm the son of a preacher, but I come from a long lineage of preachers, Black preachers, 4 generations to be precise. You know, and then, you know, so they're my ancestors. You know, they're kind of helping me through, you know, all this stuff. So that's important, you know, as I'm starting the process, you know, as I'm improvising and let things flow. So there's, again, the spirituality about creating.
Beautiful. Missy, how about you?
Yes. Well, I'm actually, this is not my space. I'm at a friend's house right now, but I love that they're artists. So every surface is like full of art. And also like, there's like kids, like at home school life cycle of a butterfly behind me, which I love. But my space in New York, my home studio is very like carefully curated, and it has pink walls. Some people have probably seen it on other Zooms because I've been stuck there for the last year and a half. And a lot of art by my friend Sam Pink, who's a painter and a writer, that I bought from him. That these weird abstract faces and a lot of postcards above the piano, which are great. Like I collect them everywhere I go. They remind me of where I've gone. I have a lot from Scotland when we did the European premiere of my second opera, Breaking the Waves, which is like just some fantastic memories. But yeah, it's very important. I mean, I go in there every day and I spend a lot of time in this one room, and so it was important to me to paint it pink and to have it be someplace that was just mine. You know, that was like didn't remind me of any other space actually.
Yeah, beautiful. And Missy, do you keep like a strict composing schedule? Like, do you say, okay, I gotta get in like 3 hours a day or 5 hours, or do you just sort of allow yourself to say, you know, I feel moved to write today and I'm going to do this? Or how do you approach that?
I mean, I approach it like a job, you know, so my goal is to work 8 hours a day. And that doesn't mean writing for 8 hours a day. I don't think I've ever done that in my entire life, but to write for 3 to 4 hours, you know, and then edit. And there's so much other stuff that comes with being a composer. Like, I mean, just answering email alone is a huge job. But, you know, and I've never, people always like, I read these books on creativity and how to be the most productive and the most creative. And they're like, you know, write at the same time every day. And I'm like, good luck. You know, like the life of a musician does not lend itself to that. Like I played a show last night, you know, up here in a small art gallery upstate. And in upstate New York. And, you know, we didn't get out of there until midnight, you know, so I'm not going to wake up at 8 a.m. and then be like bright eyed, you know, to write again. And so every day is completely different, but I do try I try to work very hard. It's always just, you have to work with the windows that you have.
Mm-hmm. Before I go on to this question, I just want to remind everyone that's listening to us as well that if you have your own questions for our composers, you can write them in the Q&A box underneath the video so that we can ask them in real time. Thank you very much. Carlos, tell me, do you, when this inspiration, I mean, let's say you have a commission, you receive the commission and you want to begin the work, do you have a ritual that you go through, or before you start something, before you start to collect your thoughts, or before, or is there, because we musicians, there is a ritual in like tuning your instrument and then sitting down, like it has to be the right chair, like the light has to be just perfect to be able to start practicing. I mean, at least for me this was the case. I need to have my pencil that writes in a certain way in order for me to mark the score. Do you have a ritual like this?
Well, first I freak out a little bit. And then, once I get my nerves in check, then it's like, okay, what do we want to say? Here's this. I think music is also a platform. I mentioned it's having something to say. And I think about, okay, whose organization? What's the best message that I can say through this organization that's commissioning me? And the community, that does, all these things sort of play into unless they have a directive, so we want to commission you to write, a piece about, I don't know, some particular visual artist or something like that. But usually it's based on a concept that I have, or that's been sort of festering in my mind. And I think it's, it's just sort of matchmaking. I have a lot of ideas, the idea box that I have, the pieces that I want to write. And so I kind of go through those and say, okay, this could be good for this, commission. And then I spend a couple weeks, months sort of researching and just kind of going, making sure that I'm in the right place to say what I need to say. Yeah, I mean, and then I start writing, and that's where, the subconscious, really plays into, that's, research and all that stuff that informs my subconscious, and it's like, okay, I can write now, and then not be so analytical about everything, because that's having to start a piece without doing research or like feeling like you're in the right place for that. Then that's when I always hit a roadblock and usually have to go back. So that's usually the process. It usually changes sometimes, but I think that's why I love being a composer, because it's different every time depending on the story or what the message that I want to say, and I love being open to the world like that.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like one of my biggest revelations as a conductor in trying to study music and to understand composers was to discover that actually every composer had their own way of teaching me how to study their music. That I couldn't study your music the way that I studied Mozart's music, because you had your language and Mozart had his. Yeah. And it's interesting for me to hear that you feel like the process of every piece actually teaches you how you need to write this piece as well. So that's very, very beautiful. Now, Karim, do you? I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask you nonetheless. So you start at the beginning and then you go to the end, or do you like jump around and you write things as you are, and then you put them in the structure? How do you do that?
Yeah, I very rarely write from beginning to end. Usually something that that sort of begins the piece in terms of my own writing. It doesn't end up being the actual beginning of the piece. I find beginning pieces, I don't know if Missy and Carlos would agree, but I find beginning pieces very difficult. It's almost like a confidence game for me. Because usually it comes right after you've finished a piece, which is a very nice feeling, and then you're right at the drawing board again, and it's almost like you need to convince yourself that you know what you're doing, what have you done for me lately kind of thing. So oftentimes the beginning of my process is very kind of scattershot and exploratory and sort of, like Carlos was saying, improvisatory. And so there are a lot of ideas that hit the page, and then only very slowly and only in a kind of piecemeal fashion, very, very slowly, do things kind of emerge that dictate sort of the structure or the architecture or whatever. And then usually there's a point in the piece where I feel like you just go over the crest of the hill, and it feels a little bit downhill. You know, it's like a really, really, really hard work. And then at a certain point you think, oh, okay, yeah, this can be a piece. I think I've got enough here. And then it becomes a little bit more, you know, smoother sailing, to mix metaphors. But you know, you keep going and you feel like you have some momentum. So it's difficult to predict, which is one of the things that I find frustrating about it. I mean, if there were a formula of how to do it, I would be so happy. But it's sort of, for me at least, it's very much not totally groping around in the dark, but it feels a little bit like that, you know, at the beginning. And then things start to coalesce and the focus starts to develop. That's how my process is. I mean, I'm sure it's different for every composer, but.
And if you don't have like a actual directive from the commissioner, you know, saying, okay, this needs to be a 5 to 10 minute piece or a 5 to 7 minute piece or whatever, how do you come about with how long your piece is? You know, like when do you decide that? When in the process do you decide that?
Well, I mean, for me anyway, it's usually the materials kind of tell you that a little bit. It's sort of intuitive for me anyway, where, you know, each idea or each thing that you do in the piece has a certain shelf life, has a certain kind of amount of juice in it, so to speak. And that once you've kind of gone through and you know, explored whatever the ideas are or whatever the trajectory of the piece is, it'll sort of tell you when it's over. There's this great quote about the click of a well-made box, which I think about a lot when I'm writing. It's like you get to a point where things sort of click and you feel like, okay, this is right, and I know how it's going to end, and I know where it's going to end and where it's going. So it's a little bit, there's a little bit of mystery to it, for me anyway. It's a little bit kind of shrouded in kind of magic. But yeah, usually the materials themselves will tell you that.
Because also, you know, I also find it fascinating that, because the whole idea of timing of a piece, you know, isn't this amazing actually? Because I mean, within reason, of course, but no two performances are going to be the same. In fact, I always clock my performances of whatever, and I write at the end of the piece, I write how fast or how slow it was this time. And sometimes I'm shocked, you know, like you go to a different concert hall, you go to a different orchestra, and in a 30-minute symphony, sometimes I can have up to like a 5-minute variation, you know, of like, was it 30 or was it 35 or somewhere in between that night, you know. And my favorite experience with that was I was performing Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto with Daniil Trifonov, and we had 5 performances, you know, and like the first 3 were basically about the same down to the second. Right. And then there was the huge event at the Bataclan that happened in Paris, you know, that massacre basically. And he was really deeply affected by this. And he told me before he walked on stage, he said, you know, I really feel very strange about performing tonight, but I just wanted to let you know. And that night, the concerto was like a good 5 minutes slower, but it made perfect sense. Like it didn't feel slow. It changed the way that the pacing of the piece, you know. So I think from a composer's perspective, you know, there's a certain element of, wow, oh my God, like what's going to happen? You know, you write a 10-minute piece that ends up being 14. You know, that's you know, there's a lot of trust, I guess, that you have to place into the hands of the performer, which leads me to our next question, Missy. I'm going to ask you this. And it says, talking of premieres, this is from Cheryl Spencer. Talking of premieres, do you always try to be there for the rehearsals ahead of the performance? And I mean, I guess you can't really be there for all the performances or the repeat performances of the piece. And I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Is it scarier to be at the premiere or to imagine that you are not going to be there for all the other performances, you know? So you have to let go, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I try to show up as much as possible. And this is something that one of my teachers, David Lang, said. He's like, whenever you can, you should show up for a premiere, even if you're not personally involved, you're not performing, you're not conducting, and so I really taken that to heart, and I really try to be there. And I think it's very important for living composers, early to middle career composers to and women in particular, and to stand up in front of people and say, I wrote this, I'm alive. I'm very much alive. You can come talk to me. I wrote this. That's a relationship that people understand, or are beginning to understand more. And so I try to show up, and then I do try to be there for rehearsals if I can. Certainly for premieres, my happiest moments in life are rehearsing for something new with a group of musicians. So bringing this, because I don't, as I said earlier, the final piece of the puzzle is performing it in front of an audience. And it's not when I finish writing it and put the double bar, it's when the musicians bring it to life. The composition is not done until it's brought to life by the players and performed in front of an audience. So completing that process is very, very satisfying. And that's the thing that I've missed most in COVID, is not actually the performances, even though I do miss them, but it's the rehearsals. And it's being in that room with people and figuring stuff out and solving problems. So I know some composers, some very close friends of mine who don't want to go to any of their own performances, and certainly not premieres because it's too much. But I've grown to really, really love that, and love the tension of being in the audience and not knowing quite how it's going to go. I love it all.
Beautiful. What about you, Carlos?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I love being a composer, because, it's once I finish the piece and I get in front of, get it to musicians and rehearse, my job is done. I just sit back, and I enjoy sitting in the audience. I as a performer and pianist, I struggle for a long time with performance anxiety, and I, that's why I went to composing, because I can just sit back in the concert hall and just sort of watch things go by instead of being so anxious in performance in front of people. And it's it's great. It's really great.
Mm. One thing I wanted to follow up actually from the previous question with you, Carlos, was what's your preference? When someone commissions you, do you have a preference on them giving you more direction or less direction, in what they're commissioning, so that you have more freedom to do what you want? Or do you enjoy the challenge of having to sort of channel things down into, it needs to be like this?
I like a little direction. I don't mind, there's some way, because it can be hard, and intimidating just to say, write a piece, it can be anything. So yeah, I don't mind. So oftentimes I would take a different direction. For instance, I just finished a commission. The piece was about basically it was about trauma, and I thought, they wanted me to write a piece about something that was I don't know if I want to traumatize my audience, again, and so I was I don't have permission to do that. So I'll go the opposite of just saying, okay, what is, positive about this situation, and sort of, but it's still about the same thing, it's about police brutality, right? And I just didn't feel like I had the permission to traumatize my audiences again. So when the different direction and discovering the families of those, slain, and what are them personalized, it's sort of the piece in a way, and highlighting positive moments. And so, yeah, it's just sort of changing the thing.
Yeah, and I have to say a big thank you to all three of you, actually, because I oftentimes have encouraged composers in my private conversations with them to really find something outside of just music, really, to something that is really deeply personal and right now, like an issue of something that is happening in the world right now, to make a statement. I really think that for me, music does not need to be the answer, but it can really play an important role in asking a question. and the way that it makes you think about the different issues of the world today and who we are, in the same way that, I mean, Beethoven did this, and Shostakovich did this, and I look back at Leonard Bernstein's music, and I'm amazed actually at all the issues that he tackled in such beautiful, different ways, and I just want to say thank you, because I know that all three of you, this is an important part of your composition, and the kind of works that you present, so I think that's someone is writing a message here saying, hearing Carlos talk about how he addressed the topic of police brutality reminds me of Karim's The Prisoner. And the question is, how did Karim address the story from within?
Well, that piece, the impetus for that piece came from me discovering the letters of Adnan Latif, who was the prisoner in Guantanamo that the piece is ostensibly about. And I was just reading kind of a long form article about it. I can't remember whether it was the Atlantic or something like that, about this fellow and his life and his death. And it had some of his poems in it, and they're just beautiful poems translated from the Arabic, of course. And so that was my entry into that piece. So it was still a kind of a artistic or poetic entry, but of course his story is just crushing. I mean, it's a very sad story, and for me, that piece was a challenge because there was so much, and maybe this relates to Carlos, what you were talking about. There was so much emotion around the story and around his fate, and he ultimately killed himself in Guantanamo. He was there for 10 years, and he was innocent, and so on and so forth. There was so much emotion, and of course it was fairly close to, I mean, Guantanamo's still open, right? So it was fairly close to the situation, and I was trying it was difficult for me to kind of make a balance between a piece that's, I don't know how to say it, like a little bit too on the nose, so to speak. Like I wanted it to be, I mean, I wanted to make a statement, and I wanted to reveal his humanity and sort of celebrate his life and also tell about his circumstances, but I also wanted the piece to have some sort of more universal type of sentiments about it. So that was always the balancing act for me when I write pieces that are ostensibly political or, that make a kind of social commentary, is to kind of have that nice, a good balancing act of a piece that people can relate to, maybe even if they didn't know necessarily the story or the background, or say it's, we live in a parallel universe where Guantanamo never existed. Would this piece still have some sort of human resonance to it? Would there be some themes that I've touched upon that still kind of resonate with people outside of the story? So that was the challenge for me for that, that kind of a piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I remember you, because I had asked you, for I think my exact words were if I were to commission you, what would you write? Right. This is before I had any power of commissioning anybody, and Karim said, this is the piece that I want to write, and then as soon as we were able to do it, then we did, and you wrote this beautiful piece. Missy, you have had incredible success with your operas, and which is a slightly different. Is it a slightly different process of composing music?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, in that the form is sort of dictated to you a little bit by the libretto, so I feel like I have this scaffolding with which to work, and it actually makes the writing much faster. I mean, still the most terrifying thing for me as a composer is the idea of writing an orchestra piece, like a 10-minute orchestra piece. I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Like, it's so scary. And it's, and I really relate. I talk to my students a lot about, we laugh a lot about this, because I'm just like, it was the scariest thing for me as a graduate student, and it's the scariest thing for me now. Much scarier than writing a 3-hour opera, honestly. But I do think for me, my, just as relates to the last question, my work is intensely narrative, even when there's no text. And I feel like all of my work is about human relationships. and the way that people undermine each other and then support each other and love each other and hate each other and blame each other. I mean, this is like fodder for like 10 lifetimes of music, and I'm just constantly mining that for inspiration. And it comes out in the most obvious way in the operas, because you have actual people on stage singing and yelling at each other, and enacting these dramas. But I do think it's a really, that is the way that I think of purely instrumental music as well. Like I think of the melodies and the harmonies as these characters in this story that are sometimes working with each other, sometimes at odds, sometimes interrupting each other. So that sort of helped me get over this, like the fear of the blank page when it comes, especially to orchestral writing. And then in terms of the harmonies and the melodies, everything, that it's all kind of coming from the same place. But there's just, again, this difference that you're in an opera, you're starting, there's something on the page to begin with that you can base the work on.
So are you involved in the creation of the libretto, or you take it, once it's finished, then this is it, and then you start to get involved?
Well, I work very closely with my librettist. Royce Vavrick is usually the librettist that I work with, and we live a mile away from each other, and we're best friends too. So we see each other almost every day, and we're always talking about, what do we want to write an opera about, or we'll see a movie, or read a news article, or a short story, or think of a situation ourselves, that we want to express on the stage. And so I'm very involved from the beginning, but then there is a point where I sort of like let him go, and I'm like, you work on it, and then he brings me a first draft, and that's what I start working on. But it's a constant back and forth.
And does he? Sorry, I'm really fascinated about opera and the opera world, because it's such a vast sort of marriage of every single art form, right? That there is. I mean, you have drama, you have visual arts, you have singing, you have poetry. Does the librettist, does he ends up influencing how the musical dramatic line develops? As in, like, let's say that he hears a reading of like a studio reading, right? A workshop, right? And do they feel like, I really didn't feel like the dramatic matched, with what I do? Like, do you guys collaborate on that as well? Like in the other direction as well?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we have this rule in the rehearsal room when Royce and I are working together, that the best idea wins, no matter who it comes from. So I don't care if it's like an intern or a costume designer or the director or the conductor. Like, I want everyone to feel, I want to create an atmosphere in rehearsal where everyone feels that they can express themselves, and I want the best idea to win. So we try to create that atmosphere where everyone's contributing, particularly the performers. Like, I don't like this idea, and I feel this way not just in opera, in all of my music. Like, I don't like this idea that I'm just handing someone a document and they're silently, making it happen without giving any feedback. Like, I want them to feel like they are a part of the creation of the work. So there are moments, but it's also, it's a tricky thing, because, I also want everyone to feel like they can do their job, so I think the best feedback that I get, from my collaborators is often the most broad, like, oh, I think this could stay in its groove a little more. Like, that's an incredibly broad comment. And I, as the composer, feel free to take that in many, many different directions. Or I remember a director, James Dara, this amazing director who I work with a lot, said, I think that in this scene, it's like we're sort of in her head, right? Like in the main character's head. And I was just like, oh my God, yeah, that's it. Like, that's the key to this scene. So it's a sort of nudge in a direction, but it's not saying, oh, this needs to be louder or faster, or, nothing really specifically musically, because that's my job. Like, I get to decide how that happens.
Right. Okay, last question, I promise, about the opera world. How aware are you, or how much do you place an important decision making in thinking of what the singer has to do in terms of the staging and the acting of it? Right? Like, right? So, because that can really affect the musical line and the singing line, right?
Well, the hilarious thing about writing opera is that I have a really bad staging of it in my mind as I'm writing it. So I'm not a director. And again, like I would never impress those staging ideas on an actual director, but I like act out the opera in my studio as I'm writing it, because so much of it is about the timing, and not just the timing of like moving from place to place, but the emotional timing of like how long would, if I'm speaking a heavy line, if someone's had there, some people are having a conversation and I say something very heavy, there might be a pause before the other person reacts, or there might not be. They could interrupt me, and so getting that sort of natural speech rhythm right is very hard, and I do it by just like putting myself in the position of the singers. And then there are really fun ones where like, you know, in my opera Breaking the Waves, like where a character takes a gun and threatens to shoot someone and then runs off of a boat. And then, so I was like literally running around as the MIDI is playing to like get the timing right. So again, I think it's important for the composer to have like an idea of the staging, even though that will probably, no one will ever see that ever. And that's good.
Carlos, tell me, so especially, you know, because I know that you worked a lot and you've accompanied some really phenomenal singers, right? So you must have a very close connection to the human voice in this way. Actually, I don't know, do you sing your compositions? Like, do you sing your musical lines, or do you prefer to play them on the piano?
Definitely not in public, but I definitely, you know, sing whenever I can, you know, when I'm writing. Especially when I'm writing opera. I just finished an opera for younger audiences, kids, and I collaborate with Mo Willems, who, you know, is this amazing illustrator. You know, people know the books. I really like Slop. So we created an opera based on the book, and it was, I'll be honest with you, it was the joy, one of the greatest joys of my life, just to kind of be a child again, you know. And I think opera, I like writing for opera because it gives me the chance to be an actor and to really tap into that space of being someone else for a minute. So my wife, she jokes with me all the time, because as I was writing the piece, she would hear me just making the most obscene noises down here in my studio. You know, I'm just trying to tap into the character, you know. I'm making these voices and all these things and just trying to put it in the music. And of course, working with Mo Willems, he's, you know, he was just sort of a bundle of life and energy. But, you know, singing is the best way to kind of get those ideas out when I'm writing opera. But again, I would never, ever share recordings with anyone, whether the singer or no one will hear it except me.
Although, you know, I do have to tell you, there are these little recordings, the little snippets of composers that, you know, are like humming their music, or they're singing their music. And as a performer, I find this so beautiful, you know, and to be able to have one more look into the way that this person imagined this music, you know, because it's so, I find like the more I perform, the more I search for the essence of the music itself. I find the dot on the paper to actually be limiting rather than you know. So any means possible where I can find another way to understand the music, you know, it really empowers me as the performer to do justice to the piece itself, you know. So don't throw away those recordings if you're singing, you know, like keep them there. If you don't want to share them, you know, like let the generations, you know, in 50 years find out, you know, what Carlos sounded like, because I think it's beautiful. So I have to, there's a question here that I will answer briefly if I can. It says, how do you locate composers and build your programs? And it's a question for me. So for me, I like to think of myself as a glutton for knowledge. You know, I like to know things. I like to research stuff. I like to know about things that I have not heard before. And then music happens to be the language that I use to communicate with the world what I discovered. And I never Karim knows a little bit about this. When I was a student at Rice University, I think I was the person that never said no to any project, right? This was sort of my middle name. Like any composer coming to me saying, "Hey, can you play on my recital?" I said, "Yes." Any musician, and you discover so many wonderful things. And then I just, what moves me, what feels right to me, then I just do that. So it's pretty simple that way. It's not a process per se. And I have to say, at first, when I started as music director of Cabrillo Festival, I was thinking, wow, I hope I can find enough things that I feel like are beautiful and interesting to create a season, And then once I started putting things on paper, that ideas that I had and thoughts that I had and music that now the biggest challenge is, okay, how are we going to fit all of this into one season? So I would say limiting myself to one season, the number of concerts is the bigger challenge right now by a factor of, 10 to 1, really. I think when, as Karim said, the internet rabbit hole process is also something that I love a lot. And you discover actually a lot of wonderful things when you sift through those. So just to answer this question, thank you. Karim, do you want to tell us something more about your music and how you express yourself in your music? I know that, this beautiful piece that you wrote, The Prisoner, tragic but beautiful, also uses the human voice. And I know that a lot of the rhythms that you use in the music are mimicking the speech pattern of a person, right? Do we find you singing around your office sometimes?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I remember reading something somewhere, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, about Stravinsky saying that he couldn't compose. He composed at the piano, and he couldn't compose if he knew someone was listening to him, listening to him on the piano. I think I sort of feel the same way, partially because I feel like any musicianship that I have sort of ends at my wrists. so people, it's never really presentable, but also because you're kind of searching around for ideas. But yeah, I definitely write at the piano. I sing a little bit. Maybe I sort of conduct through, and I encourage my students to do the same thing. I mean, doing lessons on Zoom was definitely worked out fine, but the one thing I did miss was, sitting down at the piano, or even just sort of singing together or conducting together through a passage that a student might have written, which is harder to do over Zoom. So yeah, I think something about it being in the air is just important to me when I'm writing. So yeah, I tend to do all kinds of playing or singing, or sometimes I'll sort of line up the pages and kind of conduct through them or sing through them just to kind of see if the pacing is right. So yeah, there's performing of a sort that's going on when I'm writing, for sure.
Mm. So just in the couple of minutes that we have left, since we are approaching July 4th, right? I'm just curious, how do you feel we're doing, like culturally speaking, in the U.S.? Like how do you feel? Like, where are we going? Like, what are your thoughts? Who wants to go first?
You're ending with a really small question like that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I guess I'll go ahead and go, since I'm here in DC. Well, I think the climate is at least where I am, it's pretty. It feels like things are lifting, especially coming out of COVID, the pandemic, and it just feels like a release. Being able to go to a concert again, and it's been amazing and a joy, and people are sort of relaxed a bit. So I can't say where we're going, but I'd like to be optimistic, but also be aware of what's happening. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, such a huge question. I mean, like an unanswerable question. I also, I don't know where we're going, and I vacillate between being very, optimistic and then being frustrated that we're not further along in terms of, in the classical music world, diversity of all kinds. And this is, very frustrating thing to me. But I also feel like we're finally developing a language with which to talk about these issues, and which is a step up from where I was in grad school 15 years ago. Experiencing the same thing, but like feeling like you'd be a martyr if you expressed it. No one was willing to martyr their career. That they've worked so hard for, and martyr the or give up the chance for self-expression. So I do think that I'm optimistic in that direction. And I definitely feel, yeah, that I feel like we have an opportunity with COVID to restart in a different way. And I think everyone wants to come back. Everyone is hungry for a cultural experience, but no one wants it to be exactly the way it was before. So we need to not miss this opportunity to sort of reinvent aspects of how things are programmed, who's making those decisions, how are those people chosen, how are we finding artists, and so we're at sort of a great moment potentially.
Beautiful.
I agree. I mean, I think we've maybe reached a turning point. It's sort of difficult. I mean, I would separate that question out to sort of the classical music, let's say classical music field, and the nation as a whole, which I'm a little bit less optimistic about, because I feel like especially in the classical music world, we sort of live in our own little kind of subculture bubble. I don't know how much it interacts with the country at large, but that's an open question. But yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting coming out of this. I'm particularly interested to see, how quickly people feel comfortable coming back to concerts, for instance, being in person, whether that changes, as Missy was saying, or the mode of delivery of music, in one way or the other. So yeah, it's a really, I think we're at a pivotal moment here. So it'll be curious to see what happens. But I think all of these issues that have been raised recently about representation and diversity and all that is only good. And I think that hopefully is something that'll continue to improve. But there are just so many issues in the country as a whole that maybe I'm a little less optimistic about. But if you would ask me a year ago, though, I would have been even less. So I think now, we're on a better path.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can't thank you enough for spending this beautiful hour with our listeners and with our audience. I know that you are valued, very valued and appreciated members of our Cabrillo family, and we thank you for that. We can't wait to have you back in Cabrillo so that we can celebrate your music together with you, and to be able to tell you how much we appreciate the work that you're doing. And it is really important. I think people, and Missy, it spoke so much to me when you said, that how important it is for you to be there and to say, hey, I wrote this. Like, this is who we are, and I think standing up for that is just as important as putting it on the paper, and but thank you all so much for your time, and we love you, and we can't wait to see you in person soon.
Thank you, Cristi.
Thank you so much.